Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eamon Wall, and I am the Irish Studies Smurfit Stone Professor of Irish Studies at UMSL. And I want to welcome everybody here this afternoon for our presentation. This is the 20th year of Irish Studies presentations, readings, concerts, and various events here at the University of Missouri St. Louis. So we're delighted to continue with this programming. Our next event will be on November 10th, and that will be a book launch of Galway writer Mary Madec's new collection of poetry. Mary is a native of Westport and now lives in Kinvara in County Galway. And we will send out invitations and information about that over the next few weeks. As always, I wanted a special thanks to Bob L., who's the Senior Events Coordinator for UMSL Global, who makes all of our events possible. We appreciate his work greatly. And also a thank you to the interim director of UMSL Global, Liana Constantine, for making everything possible for us. Our event today is on Zoom. We will have people connecting with us from the United States, from Ireland, the Middle East, and the UK and other places we don't really know about yet. And also we're Zooming, but we're also available on YouTube. The title of our event today is Brexit and Ireland, Myths and Realities. And the decision of the UK to leave the EU has been one of the biggest headlines worldwide for a long time. It occurred on June 23rd, 2016, but it's an ongoing issue because the separation is not complete, or perhaps hasn't even begun. I mean, depending on your point of view. Brexit has great implications for Ireland. And also, of course, it has great implications in various ways for us here in St. Louis and in Missouri. So to help us understand Brexit better, we have invited two experts along to discuss the issue and its implications. Our first speaker will be Christa Corrigan. And Christa is a communications professional and editor in the financial services industry, currently based in Dublin. And I think before that, she was based in London. A St. Louis native, Christa moved to Ireland to gain international experience and to explore her Irish roots. She holds a bachelor's in journalism from the University of Missouri in Columbia. And our second speaker is Timothy White, also a St. Louis native. And Tim is a professor of political science at Xavier University in Cincinnati. And Tim has presented for us at UMSL on other occasions as well. So we're almost happy to have him back. He's edited a number of books, he's written books, and he's written many articles, including Theories of International Relations and Northern Ireland that came out recently with Manchester University Press. Recent articles include When Did the Irish-American Diaspora Make a Difference Influencing US Diplomacy Towards Northern Ireland, with Emily Krause published last year. And he spends a lot of time in Ireland. He directs a program in Banshee and County Tipperary every year that brings many American students to Ireland. So he is a St. Louisan who spends a lot of time in Ireland, and Christa Corrigan is a St. Louisan who is currently living in Ireland. So each of our presenters will speak for 25 minutes or so, and then we will hold the questions until the end. So you'll have plenty of time to ask questions at the end. And there's a Q&A function, of course, at the bottom of your screen where you can write down your questions, and we'll take them at the end. So again, welcome everybody to Brexit and Ireland, Myths and Realities. And our first presenter is Christa Corrigan.
Thank you, Eamon, for that introduction. I just want to first check that everybody can hear me all right. Okay, then I see some nods, so I will go ahead and share my screen. Oops. Okay. Can you see the presentation now? Okay, I see some more nods. Thank you. Okay, so yes, as Eamon said, I am here living and working in Dublin. I've been here about 2 years now. And actually, before I moved to Dublin, I was based in the United States. I work for a global financial firm that is an American firm, S&P Global. It opened its first new European headquarters in Dublin in 2019, and that seemed like an opportune moment to raise my hand and ask for a transfer to come live in Dublin and help set up the first office. I work as an editor, so I edit research on financial topics around the globe, but I am speaking today completely independently of my employer. Just kind of to give some background on the Brexit debate from an American expat here with boots on the ground in Ireland. And also I just want to say, I'm not that far out of college. It's been, more years than I'm willing to say on camera right now, but I know there's a variety of people on this presentation with different backgrounds and understanding of the Brexit debate. So I'm kind of going to go over the basics of what you need to know to really understand the Brexit debate. So a little bit about international trade. One of the core tenets of the European Union is that having all of the countries form the European Union is really what helps them stand together on the global trading front. So as you can see from this chart, when you combine all of the European Union 27 countries, they really rival China and the United States in terms of their exports and imports. And in fact, they have more exports than the United States does. This chart also puts in perspective of where the United Kingdom lands when you take it out of the European Union. So it's not insignificant, but it was a big contributor to the European Union. So these are the 27 European Union countries that make up the customs union and that are fully within the European single market. It's important to note that all of these countries do have a subsect or political party that kind of is skeptical of the European Union project historically, and actually over the past 10 years, they've kind of gained more prominence as nationalism has risen across Europe. So the United Kingdom is the first country that is leaving the European Union since the project started following World War II. It's also important to note that the United Kingdom is currently still following EU rules and regulations, although it has formally left the EU. So the two biggest buzzwords you probably hear when you're following the news about Brexit is the single market and the customs union. And I think for Americans, we might not really have learned these things when we were in university. But the single market is really the whole idea of the European Union. It's all of these countries forming one territory that allows people, goods, and services and money to move around freely. So, for example, if you are a French person, you can move to Ireland, take up a job there, no problem, much in the way somebody from Missouri can move to Colorado and find employment there. But the customs union, on the other hand, is simply the rules that enforce their imports and exports. And that's important because the money from taxes on goods throughout the European Union are what fund the European Union budget, much in the way that states in the United States have produced goods that fund the federal budget. On the other hand, a free trade agreement is, you probably hear this now because people are saying, well, maybe the UK can just form a free trade agreement with the EU, similar to how Canada has a free trade agreement with the EU. But as we will get to Ireland, you'll see why it's a little bit more complicated for the UK to form a free trade agreement with the EU. So here, something that's very confusing and complicated to understand, I think, as an American, is that some countries can be part of the customs union, but not part of the single market, and vice versa. So Norway, for example, is not in the customs union, but it does participate in the single market. And Turkey is the opposite. It's not in the single market, but it does have customs union arrangements with the EU. So fact or myth? More than 4 years after the UK voted to leave the European Union in June 2016, which was about 4 years ago, Brexit is going to finally be all over at the end of this year after the transition period ends. The answer to this is no, probably not. This is still very much an ongoing issue. There has not, even though the UK has left the EU, there has not been a new trade deal agreed between the two. So that means the possibility of a no-deal Brexit still lingers. And this will happen if no trade deal is agreed and the transition period is not extended. So really, there's just a few months left in the year for an outcome to happen. And even when a new trade deal is agreed, the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is going to be ongoing. So here's my very, very simplified Brexit timeline. From the day they decided to vote to leave the EU until today. So as you can see here, it took nearly 2 years for the first exit terms agreement to be agreed between the UK and the EU, and that was decided under Theresa May. But then the UK Parliament voted it down, and Brexit was delayed a further 2 times. And then there was a surprise event when Boris Johnson took over as the UK Prime Minister, and he said he was going to scratch Theresa May's Brexit deal, come up with his own new Brexit deal because he thought hers was too loose. It was too compromising to what the EU wanted. It wouldn't let the UK move forward with its own forming new trade policies with other trading partners around the globe. In October, that's when he sent his deal. Brexit's delayed again. And then finally, in January of this year, that's when the withdrawal agreement was passed. The transition period began. And we also got COVID-19 at the same time, which really kind of took Brexit, I think, out of the news coverage as it had been. My first year living in Dublin in 2019, you would see that on the BBC all the time. But now I think the discussion has really turned to how economies are going to deal with COVID-19. And so now we're at the last stretch of the year, 2 months left, and we still don't have a trade deal. So the big burning question now is what's going to happen in December. So when we get to Ireland, another big question is how is Northern Ireland going to be treated after the UK leaves the EU? So the gray part represents the UK. Here's Northern Ireland and the Irish border, and here's the Republic, which will remain in the EU. So the question is, how can they control goods flowing in and out of Ireland? It's still very much unclear because we don't have a new trade deal yet, but I can walk you through a few scenarios. So this would be the no deal scenario or the hard Brexit, which would mean there could be customs checks on the border itself, which presents problems for Ireland for a number of reasons. It delays goods coming in and out of the Republic in Northern Ireland. People live on the border, they commute in and out of Ireland. And also it represents symbolic hardship that occurred during the Troubles or the period of violence between Northern Ireland and the Republic. From an economic perspective, it could also cause the economy to be 4 to 7% lower in a decade. So here's Boris Johnson's proposal for the border as of the withdrawal agreement being passed. So he proposed to get the withdrawal agreement passed that customs checks take place at the Irish Sea coming into Northern Ireland. But Northern Ireland is not particularly happy about this. Boris Johnson's kind of going back on what was agreed when the withdrawal agreement was passed. And this wasn't going to be a permanent solution. It was just something that was passed to be kind of discussed ongoing. And also something that's holding up the discussions today is the European Union has an entity that regulates fishing and agriculture. So there's a big question of who controls the seas between the two and who's going to regulate the fishing. How can they form an agreement on that? So for the Americans on the line, you might have seen recently that Joe Biden has come out in the headlines about this issue, and he has given a warning to the UK that anything the UK does that would breach the Good Friday Agreement, if Biden becomes president this year, he will not work with the UK on a new trade deal if they compromise the Good Friday Agreement. And this is important for Democrats, I think, especially because Bill Clinton played a critical role in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement. So it's kind of a point of pride for Democrats. But I would also say that Donald Trump might not have been as outspoken about this, but I think overall, everybody's in agreement that nobody wants a hard border between the two countries. So a little bit of background about the Good Friday Agreement is that this agreement was reached in the late 90s to end the Troubles, as I discussed before. And the issue then was that there were terror weapons across the border. And so nobody wants it happening during the Troubles. And this also acknowledged that a majority of Northern Ireland wished to remain part of the UK, though the majority of the Republic wished to have a united Ireland. You can, if you're a citizen, you can have an Irish passport, you can have a UK passport, or you can have both. So I think this is really telling in terms of why the Brexit debate is so complicated for Ireland, and because their nationalities are very much intertwined, and at least 700,000 people in Northern Ireland do hold an Irish passport. And actually, UK people applying for Irish passports really increased in the past few years after the Brexit vote happened, because they do still want to be able to, for those who do still want to live and work in Europe. So basically the EU is proposing that the UK, that Northern Ireland stay in the customs union for a longer period. The question though is like, how much longer? Would it be another year? Would it be another 5 years? This is not something that's going to be resolved immediately. And Boris Johnson is saying he wants to protect the constitutional integrity of the UK, and he wants the freedom for the UK to move on and start forming trade agreements with other countries. So that is where America comes in, because a post-Brexit trade agreement with America is still to be determined as well. And then my final slide here just also shows Irish goods exports and imports, which shows that Ireland does in fact import more from Great Britain than it exports. So any delays on goods coming in and out of Ireland could have a pretty significant impact on Ireland. But I think it's still very hard for economists to truly predict what this impact will be, especially in light of the current recession we're in globally. And this on top of the COVID-19 recession, it's very unclear what the outcome is going to be. And this is a very unprecedented time for both Ireland and Great Britain and America as well. So these are our leaders that will steer us in the direction of whatever the outcome will be. It's important to note, though, that the President of Ireland is a purely symbolic role. It's actually the Taoiseach who serves more as kind of the decision maker. And finally, my last slide, just to end on a high note. As an American living here, here's some of my my favorite sites in Ireland that I've experienced since I moved here. So that is really the basic overview. I hope for people who are experts on this issue, at least it was a refresher. And for people who haven't studied this very much, I think this will provide the background you need to understand Tim's presentation. So I will stop sharing and let him take over.
Okay. Well, thanks, Eamon and Christa, for that great background there. I'm going to put up my PowerPoint. Let's see if I can share. Oops.
Yeah, I think we lost Tim momentarily, so I'm sure he'll be back in a second.
Eamon, I think Tim's typed a question for us. He needs to be let back in the Zoom.
Okay, all right, I don't see it.
I would like to let you back in. I'm just not sure which one you are because there's 4 instances of Tim White in here.
Okay.
So I will promote all of you to panelists and we'll sort it out.
Okay, all right. Okay, yeah, thank you, Christa. You got the question before I did, so.
So hopefully the real Tim White will stand up.
Okay. I suppose the real Tim White will have to just start the video.
There we go. I think I found him.
Okay. I don't think we have him yet, Bob.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, now we just got to get the screen back up. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. It looks like a screen is starting to come in now. So
Okay, there you go.
a second.
Okay, so I'll hit my share screen. And where's the PowerPoint coming up? Can you see my PowerPoint? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
No?
Not yet, no.
Okay, let me go back to.
And I don't see your image either, Tim, on mine.
Okay, I'm not sure why that is, but you're showing Bahadur. Sorry about this. Let's see here. Share. Now do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, there
Yes.
we go. We'll get it started. You won't be able to see me, but you can see the presentation, okay?
Okay.
All righty.
We would prefer to see you, but if we can, but that's okay.
I want to thank Eamon for hosting this event and for Christa's great introduction. I'm going to talk a little about the political background, a little bit less about the economics that Christa talked about, and then hopefully we'll have some good Q&A at the end here. So historically, the British have been, I would argue, ambivalent regarding Europe. So Brexit was a development that in some ways doesn't come out of the blue. When the British first thought of entering the common market back in the 60s, the French president Charles de Gaulle vetoed their entrance. But when they decided to join after de Gaulle's exit in 1973, they were joined by Ireland and Denmark. And then in 1975, right after entering, there was a referendum in Britain on membership in the EEC, as it was called then, and the overwhelming majority of British voters decided to stay in the EU. So there was a precedent for a vote in favor or against the EU, and in the 70s, the British voted to stay, but there was obviously some opposition. This ambivalence continued on when the British decided not to join the Eurozone in the 1990s and keep their own currency, the pound sterling. And the persistence of skeptics towards Europe, especially in the Conservative Party, continued. Even under Margaret Thatcher, there were many conservatives who didn't like Europe, thought it somehow encroached upon British sovereignty. Finally, in the referendum that came in 2016 was done by Prime Minister Cameron to appease Eurosceptics within his own party. He believed he would be able to convince British voters to stay in the EU. He was a big supporter of it. But after the vote happened, he was humiliated and resigned, and Theresa May became the prime minister. The election, even when Brexit happened, was closer than some people remember, perhaps. It was a 52 to 48% vote in favor of leaving the EU. But there was a big difference in the different constituencies or districts of the UK of how people voted. Basically, the Celtic periphery of the UK, Scotland and Northern Ireland, especially, and some parts of Wales, voted to remain in the EU. But Northern England, especially some of the old manufacturing belt, voted heavily against it. You can see the areas in and around London tended to remain in the EU because the financial sector was seen as critical to them and they wanted to maintain ties to other parts of Europe. But obviously the voters did vote to leave, and Theresa May became committed to fulfill the voters' slight majority in favor of leaving the European Union. How do we interpret this? One scholar living in England has argued Brexit has at least 3 potential meanings. I think many people offer other meanings, but Nicolaitis argues that one meaning is exodus, that Brexit means an exit of Britain from the European Union. And she argues this meant that Britain was never fully European, the same way other countries in the EU have become integrated. Or perhaps another way of thinking about it is Europeans were never able to accommodate Britain's identity and history in their own country. Secondly, sorry about that. Go back to the previous slide here. Nicolaitis argues that it's a reckoning for the EU, meaning that perhaps what happened with the UK might happen to other parts of the EU as voters decide they somehow think they might be better off without being a member of the EU any longer. The third meaning could be sacrifice, for the British to regain sovereignty and for the EU not to abandon principle. The British clearly believed when they voted to leave the European Union, they were going to gain something by getting their sovereignty back. And that idea is important in some of the other work that's been done. I'll talk about in a minute. A lot of scholars see Brexit as part of a larger global phenomenon of the return of authoritarianism, of the desire to somehow go against globalization, the creation of a more cosmopolitan, Western-dominated global culture, which is based on neoliberal economics, free markets, that clearly elites around the world benefited from, economic, political, cultural elites benefited from, but many who were in the old manufacturing sectors of traditional societies like in the United States and Britain lost out in this. And as a result, they returned to sort of authoritarian leaders who they thought could really return them to their past. And Fintan O'Toole's book, Heroic Failure, highlights the sort of desire by the British, as he sees it, to return to an era of empire. Now, this is obviously an antiquated view of Britain's contemporary position, but it's a popular one that highlights the need for the British to somehow recreate their national greatness that is minimized in the logic of a much larger European Union, in which, while they're still significant, they're clearly not as important economically and increasingly politically as the Germans or the French, let's say. Irish nationalists saw the Brexit as a threat to the peace and an opportunity for Irish unity. So people both north and south of the border who identified themselves as Irish nationalists saw Brexit as a potential opportunity to end partition, which they saw as a British imposed reality upon the island of Ireland in 1920, early 20s. They also saw it as threatening peace, which was achieved under the Good Friday Agreement by breaking down the barrier that partition had created nearly 100 years ago. For the Irish government, Brexit was a short-term challenge to meet some of the export demands that Christa talked about, the need to have exports to the UK, which are important to the Irish economy, and imports as well, but exports are really the driving force to the Irish economy these days. And it's also important to recognize the Irish government was committed. All the major political parties have been committed to the Good Friday Agreement and living up to its terms, trying to make sure that the institutions that were created by the agreement are operationalized and up and functioning in terms of a Northern Ireland Assembly, power sharing executive, North-South Ministerial Council are especially important to the Irish government. So I think to understand why the border is such a big part of the debate that Christa talked about, you have to understand how the Good Friday Agreement can be seen as a boundary settlement. And this idea of boundaries is incredibly important in scholarship and international relations. recent scholars have talked about how borders were the basis of conflict. If you study the early European international system that was created, most scholars see after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, most of the early wars were over territory, over who should control Alsace-Lorraine or some other territorial part of Europe. But increasingly, scholars argue that our understanding of borders is not nearly as based upon territorial or defined space as it is more modern conception of how we conceive of borders that are more permeable. And scholars, both constructivist IR scholars and geographers, are stressing that borders are really divisions we create in our minds, which can be reconceived, reconceptualized, and are not as stark perhaps as our traditional conception of a border being a separation of one piece of territory from the next. So how do we understand this logic of borders in the context of Irish partition and a boundary settlement coming out of the Good Friday Agreement? As Christa showed, there are 6 counties of the old province of Ulster, which became Northern Ireland when the British declared the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. And the British took very good census every 10 years and knew exactly where Unionists were centered and dominated. And they chose these 6 Northeast counties because these were counties that would have a majority Protestant population and would provide a large enough space, they believed, for a Unionist Northern Irish entity to be created and sustain itself in the aftermath of Ireland's partition. Now, each actor at that time, and I would argue throughout the last 100 years, has seen this partition differently. Nationalists saw the border as temporary. Michael Collins was famous for calling it a stepping stone toward a 32-county Irish republic. Unionists, while initially in the 19th century wanting all of Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom, came to see partition as a way of securing a Protestant majority for themselves within this new territory of Northern Ireland. The British, when they drew up the border, saw partition as a compromise of trying to appease Unionists, who were loyal to them in a sense, and nationalists demanding more autonomy and independence from the UK. And the Irish government, as they emerged, and especially as De Valera, who became the dominant political force in 20th century Ireland, saw the border as illegitimate and claimed sovereignty over the entire island when he wrote the new Irish Constitution in 1937. So in some ways, even though partition didn't immediately lead to conflict in the sense of violence, it was inherently unstable because the Irish government was never satisfied with the 26 counties. They actually claimed jurisdiction over all 32 counties. And Northern nationalists were not happy with the discrimination they experienced based on a Protestant government that was always elected representing the majority of people who were Protestant living in Northern Ireland after the partition process. So Henry Patterson has argued that the border represented what he called a violent frontier that inevitably fostered the Troubles, even if it didn't happen right after independence. It was an important part of the process of how Northern Ireland became this violent space after the Civil Rights Movement failed and attempts to bring about peaceful change in Northern Ireland weren't realized. Violence became a means of trying to pursue Irish unification, especially for the Provisional IRA. The Good Friday Agreement was probably its unappreciated achievement was that it ended the near-term debate about the border and what the constitutional status of Northern Ireland should be. It said that all parties in Northern Ireland agree, and the United Kingdom's government and the Irish government, the Irish rescinded parts of their own constitution in order to satisfy the Good Friday Agreement, claimed that the status of Northern Ireland can only change based on the principle of majority consent. There have to be referendums in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland simultaneously to change the status of Northern Ireland being part of the UK. Or in other words, for Ireland to ever experience unification, it would be required by consent in both jurisdictions. As such, what the Good Friday Agreement proved that territory is not as fixed as we might conceive of it. While Irish people historically see the border as inherently unfair, inappropriate, unacceptable, they were ready to compromise and recreate a sense of what could be achieved and possible based on a border if the border would become relatively meaningless. And over the last 20 some years since the Good Friday Agreement, if you cross the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, it is quite seamless. And that was partly because both jurisdictions were part of the European Union. There was no need for customs controls or any other kind of economic barrier between the two territories. It was important to realize that Northern Ireland, from an Irish perspective, went from being part of a claim that scholars call irredentus, to claim territory that they didn't want to give up jurisdiction over, to say Northern Ireland's future should be established through the norm of consent, that the consent of the people of Ireland, North and South, should determine what happens to the status of Northern Ireland. And Osiak research emphasized, looking at the survey research that was done over the decades in the Irish Republic, that Irish unification gradually gave way to a redefinition of what the goal for people in the Republic of Ireland was regarding Northern Ireland. It wasn't short-term unification, it was peace in Northern Ireland within a process that could be created where unification could happen based on democratic principles, majority consent. So despite the arbitrary nature of the border, designed initially to maximize Protestant votes in Northern Ireland for a Protestant government there, the EU membership that have emerged facilitated a peace process and an open border that benefited everybody. Very few unionists complained about the open border that existed after the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, many of them economically benefited, especially Protestant farmers who established important trade with their agricultural products in the Republic of Ireland. The EU continued to support the peace process as part of their general regional policies. And Giada Lagagna, an Italian scholar, is got a book that just came out talking about how systematically the EU has supported Northern Ireland's peace process from the foundation of the EU almost, since it was created, and really especially since the 1970s. Sandra Buchanan has done a lot of work highlighting how EU peace programs and funding have facilitated grassroots peace building in the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement and even before, but it continues to provide local communities within Northern Ireland and the border communities of the Republic of Ireland peace building funding to try to ameliorate some of the economic challenges and social grievances that might have historically existed among people based on sectarian differences. If I have a minute here, I want to play you a brief video. This video was made a couple years ago. I'm just going to play a bit of it. It stars Stephen Ray, a Northern Irish actor, who talks about why the border is such a big idea and how it was important in the context of the Brexit debate. So this is the brief bit of a film with Stephen Ray.
Tim, we can't hear it.
Oh, I apologize for that. I apologize for that.
Okay.
I'll just keep going then. The purpose of that video was to try to show you how artists have tried to describe this ambiguity that exists. And the ambiguity is well explained in an article that's forthcoming in Political Studies that suggests that there's a fundamentally disconnect between the British government's goal, especially in the Conservative Party led by Boris Johnson, of simultaneously delivering Brexit, where the UK will leave the EU, and somehow Northern Ireland remaining within the EU, both within the customs union as well as the internal market. And that contradiction, no British politician can work out. It's literally magical thinking, as some would see. Theresa May tried to have it both ways when she first proposed the withdrawal agreement by having a backstop so that if no compromise could be reached that would satisfy the British desire to leave the EU and the desire for Northern Ireland to have no partition border or a free flow of goods, people across the border in Ireland, that failure to get the unionist support she needed to stay in power meant she ended up losing her position, and she was replaced obviously by Boris Johnson, the current prime minister, who was able to get through a new election, a much larger conservative majority. He no longer needed the DUP support. And his withdrawal agreement was in some ways less ambiguous. It had a Northern Ireland protocol that guaranteed that there would be no internal border on the island of Ireland. Johnson didn't seem to be too long committed to that, because soon thereafter, he was able to redefine what he thought that meant and defy the actual agreement that he and the EU agreed upon. Mary Murphy at University College Cork has emphasized the challenge that Brexit poses, not just to fulfilling the Good Friday Agreement, that there should be an open border between the north and south of Ireland, but the relationship between the British and Irish governments. Under Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern in the era of the Good Friday Agreement, and really almost a decade that came after that, the British Prime Minister and the Irish Taoiseach coordinated their activities extremely closely to guarantee and work to get the peace process to operate. Unfortunately, the British government increasingly makes claims and changes in policy without any coordination or consideration of what the Irish government's position is. And the Irish government has been very keen to get the EU on their side since they're still in the EU. And this usually means that the British have to change their policy or position in order to accommodate the more powerful actor, the EU, in this process of negotiating their withdrawal from the EU and eventually their trade relationship with EU states. So this has been a very difficult time and challenging time for British-Irish relations. And Micheál Martin recently held a summit with Boris Johnson, which he claims went fairly well, but one wonders if any commitments he received at that summit will be followed up upon. In general, scholars, Fergal Cochrane just published a book called Breaking Peace, which argues that Brexit is increasingly seen as a threat to the peace that's been achieved by the Good Friday Agreement. And while I don't think the British government intends to cause any problem in terms of North-South relations or conflicts by dissident groups in Northern Ireland, the reality is the unanticipated consequence of Brexit is a real challenge to peace that has been achieved. I'll finish up by arguing a couple points. First is that opinion polls clearly suggest that Northern Ireland for the near term is going to stay within the UK. There's no survey data, especially in Northern Ireland, suggests anything close to majority would support unification of North and South in Ireland. But like any other set of surveys, people's attitudes can change. Sources of change could come from Northern Ireland's experience in Brexit. If Brexit is an economic disaster by Northern Ireland remaining within the UK and being somehow isolated from its trading partners in the Republic of Ireland and other parts of the EU, some people in Northern Ireland who presently favor Brexit and staying in the UK may change their mind. There's also a long-term demographic shift going on where gradually Catholics are becoming a larger percentage of the population in Northern Ireland, and that may shift the process of people's identity being more favorable to Irish unification. And finally, Irish success in attracting foreign investment has created a desire by many in the North to share in that kind of success and attract investment. And if they find being outside the EU minimizes that, they may seek a way of trying to replicate the Republic's success in attracting foreign investment for future economic growth, which might make Irish unification more attractive to some. Brexit could result in a UK-EU trade agreement that prevents any internal barrier in Ireland. But so far, what the British have passed through the House of Commons, the Internal Market Bill, suggests that the British plan on reneging on their agreement, that there would be no internal barriers to trade. And most scholars and economists I've read believe that there will have to be some kind of way of regulating the flow of goods, especially between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, if Northern Ireland is an internal part of the UK and there is no effective checking of goods from the north to the rest of the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and so much, Christa, for those wonderful presentations that complement each other so nicely. It is as if you were sitting in the same room putting these presentations together. Of course, impossible because Tim is in Cincinnati and Christa is in Dublin. You know, so but they dovetailed beautifully. Thank you so much. Apologies for some of the little technical difficulties. Our audience realize that in all things Irish, we are dealing with interlopers. And these tech-savvy interlopers are sometimes called the little people, other times called the fairies. So they play havoc with our good intentions at times and get involved in things that they shouldn't. They're like sometimes I'm in my basement. Sometimes my cats come down and jump up on my table when I'm doing Zooming. So the fairies do similar kinds of things. But the presentations were wonderful. So I would like now just to open up the discussion to people in the audience. So if you have any questions, you can just put them type them into the Q&A, and we'll direct them to Christa and to Tim or both. So if you have any questions, please just start typing. And if perhaps while people are getting their thoughts together a little bit, maybe I could just begin with a question for Christa, which interests me greatly, is the impact of COVID-19 on Brexit, and you mentioned it, right? And I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about it.
I think it's still hard to say how the two are related, but I think COVID-19 has really taken Brexit out of the news significantly. Like I said before, my first year living in Ireland, at my office we had the BBC on, and every day it was a Brexit update. It was or Kate. The royal couple leaving the UK. Those were the two big stories on the news. And now we're not really seeing that. It's all about COVID-19 and how Boris Johnson's handling the COVID-19 restrictions. And in Ireland, it's all about how the Taoiseach here is handling the COVID-19 restrictions, which of course is a big debate as it is in the United States.
Okay. All right. Okay. Very good. Very good. And I'm still waiting for more people to come in with the question. So let me just ask one of Tim then. And of course, I'm very interested in the idea of a border as a line but also the idea of a border as a kind of something that we create in our minds, right, or in our consciousness. And so it's a very interesting idea, and I suppose the Irish people in the Republic, they shifted, right, so that the border in the Irish mind now, in the Republic, the border is puts Ireland as part of the EU, right?
Right.
Yeah. So just if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Well, I think most people historically saw Northern Ireland as simply a piece of territory that either had to belong to the United Kingdom or to the Republic of Ireland. So you might see bumper stickers on cars that say Brits out or 26 plus 6 equals 1. These sort of simplistic ways of thinking about Northern Ireland as either having to be in the UK or Ireland. And if that's the only way you think about Northern Ireland, it's a pretty insolvable conflict. I remember when I was an undergrad at UMSL, there was a professor, Lyman Tower Sargent, who used to say there are 3 insoluble conflicts in the world, and one of them was Northern Ireland, right? To the extent to which the Good Friday Agreement worked, it diffused this simplistic notion of what Northern Ireland is. And it was based on John Hume, the architect of the Good Friday Agreement's conception that what needed to be done is you needed to redefine Northern Ireland, not as just a piece of territory, but as a set of relationships. There's 3 sets of relationships that reflected the 3 strands of the Good Friday Agreement. The relationships between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. Can they get along? Can they get along better than they used to? Do their identities have to be purely conflictual? Can they cooperate on any realm? The second relationship is North and South in Ireland. Can these 2 entities get along better? Can they create more trade, more common purposes for tourism, fishing, all kinds of issues that might cross the border? And thirdly, can the island of Ireland and the island of Britain get along better? So they created a British-Irish Council as the 3rd strand of the Good Friday Agreement. What this allowed to happen is that people didn't focus on whether Northern Ireland was part of Ireland or the UK. It was, for Unionists, it was part of the UK. For people who are nationalists, the Good Friday Agreement allows you, if you're born in Northern Ireland, to be Irish. You can have an Irish passport. Even to this day, I think it's 700,000 people in Northern Ireland will remain in the EU because they have Irish passports and they're Irish citizens. If you're Irish, you're a member of the European Union. So if you could redefine relationships and conceptions of sovereignty in a way that isn't so tight and fixed on a territorial border in our traditional sense, that allows that to happen. And there's a whole branch of international relations scholarship started by a scholar, Alexander Wendt, who's now up the road here in Columbus at Ohio State, called constructivism, where he argues we construct our realities. Each of us constructs what a border means to us. So a border might mean something very different in Northern Ireland than it does in Kashmir, for example, where another border conflict exists. So the way to solve some of these conflicts, historically, scholars have argued, is to redevelop the sense of what the relationships are, as Hume saw it, or the senses of identities across groups in these spaces historically called territorial units or states.
Okay, thank you. So there's two questions for both panelists. So I'm just going to read these out, and very topical. It's an anonymous attendees. I hear some Irish in the US who are giddy that Brexit will lead to unification. So is that mirrored in the Republic? Secondly, are there conspiracy theories that Putin was an interloper in a close Brexit vote in Britain so as to cause discord? So two very different questions. I don't know, Christa, do you want thoughts on any of these?
Sure. I think for the question about unification, I think it's important to understand that the younger generation of Irish, so those born basically in the 1990s, they really grew up in a time where it was after the Good Friday Agreement, so it's just kind of what they're used to in a way. I don't think that they have the same sentiment as their parents do. And the political party Sinn Féin had a big resurgence this year, and I think a lot of young people have rallied around them because they've made domestic Republic of Ireland issues as their key to their platform more, which I think younger people in the Republic are more concerned about right now, and that's the high cost of living in Ireland. That's kind of a lack of job opportunities for people coming out of college. I think people in Ireland who are younger, they're more concerned about their own futures, to be honest, right now, rather than the unification of both Northern Ireland and the Republic. Tim, if you want to add on that.
Yeah, there has been some talk recently, especially in Washington, that Irish unification is coming. There are some foreign policy elites that have influence in Congress and some of the think tanks that suggest that Irish unification is happening more than it's likely to do so. I think it's important to realize that most Irish Americans don't think about this much or care. There are a few elites who spend a lot of time and effort trying to influence our politicians to care about this, especially groups like the Friends of Sinn Féin and some others. But the vast majority of Irish Americans think about their identity on St. Patrick's Day, not often. Otherwise, they wouldn't have that strong of opinions about Brexit or immediate Irish unification. They might have a general idea that they like Ireland, they want Ireland to succeed and Irish people to be happy, but it's not as concrete as that. And I think Christa's right on about Sinn Féin's success within the Republic of Ireland's elections was based not on their stance towards Northern Ireland, but being able to redress a lot of people's anxiety about high cost of housing and other social problems that exist that the previous Irish government wasn't addressing.
Okay, all right. Wonderful, very good. This is another question for both of you from an anonymous attendee. Do you think the lack of news coverage will impede or slow down the Brexit process?
I'll go first on that, I guess.
Oh,
I think it will. I don't know. It's hard to say, but I think in the short term it's going to impede it because I think more news coverage would put pressure on all the parties, including the British government, to make the necessary concessions. Boris Johnson claimed early in the year that this all had to be wrapped up by the end of this year. From the beginning, the Irish Foreign Minister Coveney said that's never going to happen. The amount of detail that needs to be worked into fishing and other kinds of very specific economic realms weren't likely to get finished this year. And since little has been successfully achieved thus far, it's not as if there's momentum rapidly, coming towards the end of the year to wrap everything up. So, but I think Johnson may believe that by stonewalling the EU till the very end, he'll get more concessions that way than incrementally making concessions throughout the year. But I think pressure would mount on the British government more. I think the EU views themselves in a stronger negotiating position to sort of make the British cave to the extent to which they can. Some trading partners, like the Dutch and others, are going to get hurt if there isn't a really good trade agreement that allows EU and British trade to continue. So there is pressure within some EU states, especially to try to get some kind of deal done that continues the existing trade relationships.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. I don't see any more there for the moment. So so just let me close things up then. And so I think that both of these presentations were tremendously interesting and tremendously relevant, I think, to our lives here in St. Louis, to our Irish American world, and to our and to our whole context with Europe. And it was wonderful to have two connected but quite different perspectives. And so I greatly appreciate very much Christa Corrigan and Tim White for taking the time out to return here to St. Louis and to revisit their lives here in a way, and bring us up to date on these on these, and these important and momentous events and things taking place. I suppose, Christa, when you showed your the last of your slides about the wonderful things in Ireland, I couldn't help but feeling a kind of sorrow and anxiety for you, because you're probably not allowed to come home here to St. Louis now, for the time being. So we hope that you will get back here soon, and that you will continue to work so well and to do such good work as a journalist in Ireland. And of course, Tim always has one foot in the Midwest, in Cincinnati and St. Louis, and another one in County Tipperary. So we hope Tim is a long way from Tipperary at the moment.
It is a very long way. I have not been to Tipperary since March, so it's a long
right.
time.
So we hope that he will get back there soon. And for my own case, I'm hoping to get back to see my mother in Wexford soon. She's 93, and she says things are not much change for her with COVID, because she's at home most of the time anyway, and quite happy. So thank you so much, Christa. Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks to everybody for zooming in St. Louis, or in the Middle East, or in England, or in Ireland, or wherever you might be. And we certainly appreciate your involvement and your support. And we look forward to again to having you on one of our other Irish Studies events on campus or virtually. So a big thank you and an applause to both Tim and to Christa for these wonderful presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eamon.
Thank you, Eamon.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was bye-bye. It was wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you so